Hello, hello. Hey, guys. Did everybody see the sign that we're having issues here? Yeah. We started just having water bubbling up out of the ground. I guess last night or this morning, water was just bubbling up out of the ground and over by, in between this building and the other building, and I mean at a pretty good clip. And apparently there's a pipe underneath there that broke and has anyway, you have to pull it, you have to cut out the concrete to get down to it. And so that's the good news is, the bathrooms in the activity building are still usable. We don't have any water in this building right now. We should by Sunday. I mean, we got folks coming, but no. No. The one that's caused all those puddles out there for a long, long time, on the one hand, it's the city's problem because the water, it's not on our meter. So we haven't been charged for any of that water bubbling up over there. But fixing it is still our issue, even though it's the line that comes in to supply the sprinklers for the fire system. So anyway, let me see if Dawn, are you at the place where you can stop? Okay, it's that clock is 4 minutes slow. So So anyway, it's always something with the luckily we have a plumber who's a church member. I don't know if you know Shauna Gall, who's our preschool director. Her husband Keith Gall owns Cooper Perry Plumbing, so they can usually get out here pretty quick. when Shauna says, "Get out here quick," she says, "Get out here," like now. So, yeah. So, I think they're going to try to see if they can't get it fixed tomorrow. But it changed our plans on this, and it changed the youth plans because they were going to have an outdoor worship tonight, but Michael, our praise team leader, back in the ER with, I think, his leg that got torn up, and he tore his calf muscle a couple of weeks ago. If you're in that service, you notice he comes out on crutches and sits on a stool like I've been, and he tore his leg muscle, and I'm not sure. I haven't talked to him since yesterday when I found out he had to go back. I think he had to go back to the ER or back to somewhere, and was not able to do tonight what he was planning on doing. So, and I went to the doctor this morning myself for my follow-up on my injection into my hip and all that, and told him basically, it didn't really do anything, and they're going to try it again in about 6 or 7 weeks to see if maybe they missed the target, so they could try it again. But I don't know. Luckily, most of the time it's not that bad. It's going to have to get a lot worse before I would have surgery. It's going to have to get a lot worse. They said, Mark, our choir director, he had hip replacement a couple of 3 years ago, and his got to the place where he couldn't sleep. He was in pain 24/7, and that's when you got to get the surgery. But mine is not at that level. It's just if I stand up for a long time, it starts to throb and hurt. So yeah, it kind of is. Yeah, I was telling the fella at my doctor appointment today. I said, yeah, most days it's not that bad, but on Sunday morning, I'm standing up pretty much the whole morning, and if I stand up for a while without a break, when it starts to be pain. That's why Sundays I've been sitting down for a few minutes here, or a minute or two, and then I'm okay to stand up again. But he also told me I could strengthen my medicine. So he gave me a stronger prescription, and that may help me out too, without making me goofy. You don't want. But getting old is not easy. Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, and of course this Sunday's Palm Sunday, and then we're Easter, and we got a lot of good stuff coming in the next week. And I was telling the little preschoolers today at their chapel, tried to tell them about Palm Sunday. So it's a busy week with starting Monday with our breakfast and all that stuff. So we're going to wrap up most of David's story, at least the major conflict. We may not get into what happens at the very beginning of 1 Kings, but spoiler alert, David dies. But I mean, everybody does. I mean, so yeah. Yeah, I don't know if you've been watching. Yeah, I was watching more of the House of David on Prime, and of course it only goes up through Goliath. I mean, it doesn't go. The first season only goes up through the David and Goliath story. So I think they're going to have to go 10 seasons if they're going to go at the pace that story has gone. But the way they had Goliath was I thought pretty good, including those really mysterious parts of Genesis that talk about the sons of God and the daughters of men, and the result was the mighty men, the Nephilim. And you're like, does that mean what it sounds like it means? Oh, to Goliath, you mean? I think it bounced off the shield and right up into that. He was wearing the helmet, and there was like a little notch, and they said it's an impossible shot. I think the rock ricocheted off the shield and onto his head. So I think we're meant to see. Yeah. So, but yeah, and then of course that stunned him enough for David. They did not show in bloody detail him cutting off his head with the sword, but which, in the children's version of the story, they probably don't have that part either. The cutting off his head part. Yeah. There's a lot of things that are a little gruesome in some of these stories that don't always make it into the, especially the children's versions of the story. And yeah. Well, I mean, again, the Noah's Ark story, is kind of presented a very, lots of children illustration, and got to ignore all the people drowning, that are a part of that story. Think about that when you see the little animals tripping up the gangplank and all that, about all the people being drowned. So, yeah, I always thought it's interesting that the Noah story is kind of thought of in a very childlike way, because we kind of forget about all the people that don't make it onto the ark. So, anyway, we ended last week with Absalom's conspiracy. And we ended with how, he kills his half-brother in revenge for the rape of Absalom's full sister. He plotted and waited 2 years to take that revenge. He's not, the one he killed, his half-brother, Amnon, when he rapes Tamar, there is, no real consequence to him other than David being displeased. And so Absalom takes his revenge, plots the murder of his half-brother Amnon. Now he's a murderer. He's sort of exiled, and but then, especially with Joab's sort of maneuvering, and Joab saying, bring him back, let him come back. Absalom comes back to Jerusalem to reunite with his father, but now he had plotted for then 4 years of that to win the hearts of the people, as we ended how he sat by the city gate as people were coming to the king to settle a dispute. Oh, if only I were settling your dispute, boy, you'd win. I'm on your side. Too bad there's no justice for you up there. And he spun this way to win the hearts of the people. He said to David, I'm going to have a big feast, and gets a big crowd up there, and in the middle of that proclaims himself king. And the prominent citizens who were there at the feast are in a bind. Well, if we stand up and say, no, you're not, David's the king, do they lose their lives? If they go with Absalom and Absalom's revolt fails, are they now traitors? I mean, there's lots of decisions to be made about taking sides, but Absalom has won the hearts of many of the people, declares himself king, and David feels like he has to flee Jerusalem. That's where he picked up with 15:13, with David fleeing from his son. 15:13, a messenger came and told David, the hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom. And David said to his officials who were with him in Jerusalem, come, we must flee, or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave immediately. He'll move quickly to overtake us and bring ruin upon us and put the city to the sword. David chooses to flee rather than try to put up a fight at that moment. He feels like if they stay, they'll all be dead. 15, the king's officials answered him, your servants are ready to do whatever the Lord the king chooses. The king set out with his entire household following him, but he left 10 concubines to take care of the palace. Remember, concubine is kind of the nice word for harem girl, the ones that were for the king's pleasure. He leaves 10 of those concubines behind to just take care of the house. So the king set out with all the people following him. They halted at a place some distance away. All his men marched past him, along with all the Kerethites and the Pelethites and the Gittites who had accompanied him from Gath. Gittites are actually Philistines who had now come over and become part of David's personal, army, his personal strike force. So David's followers are not only Israelites, but that some of them are foreigners who had sided and come along David. And the Gittites are are those from Gath, which is where Goliath was from. And the king said to Ittai, who's a Gittite, which means he's a Philistine, "Why should you come along with us? Go back and stay with King Absalom. You're a foreigner, an exile from your homeland. You came only yesterday, and today shall I make you wander about with us? When I don't know where I'm going, go back, take your countrymen, may kindness and faithfulness be with you." In other words, you didn't sign up for this when you came and became part of my band. And this Ittai, who's a Philistine who has become now part of David's personal, mercenaries or strike force, whatever, says to him, "As surely as the Lord lives, and as my lord the king lives, wherever my lord the king may be, whether it means life or death, there will your servant be." So I'm sticking with you, David. So David says to him, "Go ahead, march on." And Ittai the Gittite marched on with all his men and the families that were with him. So these are, as I say, foreigners from Gath who have now become part of David's men. The whole countryside wept aloud as all the people passed by, the people who all of David's people who are leaving with him from Jerusalem. The king also crossed the Kidron Valley, and all the people moved on towards the desert. Zadok was there too, all the Levites who were with him carrying the Ark of the Covenant. So they picked up the Ark out of the tabernacle there in Jerusalem, and they're carrying the Ark with them, with David, as he leaves Jerusalem. They set down the Ark of God, and Abiathar, who was one of the priests, offered sacrifices until all the people had finished leaving the city. But then, verse 25, David says to Zadok, the priest, "Take the Ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he'll bring me back and let me see it again. If he says, 'I'm not pleased with you,' then I'm ready. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him." So he's not going to remove the ark from Jerusalem. He just had it come out with them for a time of worship, and then he sends the priest back to Jerusalem with the Ark of the Covenant. And he says then to Zadok the priest in verse 27, "Aren't you a seer? Go back to the city in peace with your son Ahimaaz and Jonathan, son of Abiathar. You and Abiathar take your 2 sons with you. I'll wait at the fords in the desert until word comes from you to inform me." So Zadok and Abiathar took the Ark of God back to Jerusalem and stayed there. So David is setting up now. How is he going to get information about what's happening in Jerusalem? The 2 sons of the priests are the ones that he says they need to be the ones that are the couriers of information, so I know what's happening with Absalom in Jerusalem. He's setting them up as men who would be able to do this without arousing a whole lot of suspicion because they're part of the priestly families. David continued up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. His head was covered and he was barefoot. These are signs of mourning, as he is leaving in, sorrow, abandoning the king's city, abandoning the palace, leaving to avoid death at the hand of his own son. All the people with him covered their heads too, were weeping as they went. Now, David had been told, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. This was not somebody that we paid a whole lot of attention to before, but Ahithophel is one of David's chief advisors. It's a surprise that he has not left with David, that he has now gone over to Absalom. Ahithophel, one of David's chief advisors, has not left with David. He has stayed in Jerusalem. He has gone over to Absalom's side. And so David prayed, "O Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness." Ahithophel, we're going to find out, is one of David's chief strategists, one of the people who is one of his chief advisors. And to lose him is a blow. But David's prayer is, even though he is a very clever man, a very wise and clever counselor, he says, let his advice be foolish this time. When David arrived at the summit, where people used to worship God, in other words, remember there used to be shrines and temples and altars all over the place until David solidified Jerusalem as the center of worship. Hushai, the Archite, was there to meet him, his robe torn and dust on his head. David said to him, "If you go with me, you'll be a burden to me. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, 'I'll be your servant, O king. I was your father's servant in the past. Now I will be your servant,' then you can help me by frustrating Ahithophel's advice." So, this fellow, Hushai, is another one of David's chief advisors. He's going with David, and David says, "No, here's what you can do. You go back to Jerusalem. You pretend that you are now loyal to Absalom, and you do your best to make sure that the advice he gets is bad. Make sure you are there to basically sabotage his plans." It says, "Won't the priests Zadok and Abiathar be there with you? Tell them anything you hear in the king's palace, and their 2 sons, Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, and Jonathan, son of Abiathar, are there with them. Send them to me with anything you hear." So David is setting up plans. One of his friends is going in to pretend to be loyal to Absalom, but really to be there to give him bad advice. The 2 sons of the priests are there to be messengers to keep David informed as to what's going on. So David is planning at least some way to try to counter what Absalom is going to do. So David's friend arrived in Jerusalem as Absalom was entering the city. So David has what do you want to call it, a spy there in Absalom's court now. When David had gone a short distance beyond the summit, there was Ziba, the steward of Mephibosheth. Remember who Mephibosheth is? Yeah, Saul's grandson, Jonathan's son, who, remember, was dropped as a baby. His feet are all messed up. He can't walk properly. That David had said, "Is there anybody in Saul's family that I can basically be kind to?" And they said, "Well, Jonathan had a son, Mephibosheth," they said, "who's crippled in his feet." And remember, David had Mephibosheth come and eat at his table and restored to him Saul's properties, and told this fellow Ziba, who had been Saul and Jonathan's servant, he says, "Now you need to go work the land for the benefit of Mephibosheth. You need to work the family property of Saul's family. Just as you were a servant to Saul and his children, now you serve his grandson Mephibosheth. You work their land, and Mephibosheth will eat at my table in Jerusalem." So now this is that same Ziba who's now coming to David, this servant. He had a string of donkeys saddled and loaded with 200 loaves of bread, 100 cakes of raisins, 100 cakes of figs, a skin of wine. And the king asked Ziba, "Why have you brought these?" And Ziba answered, "The donkeys are for the king's household to ride on. The bread and the fruit are for the men to eat. The wine is to refresh those who are exhausted in the desert." And the king then asked, "Where is your master's grandson?" In other words, where is Mephibosheth? "Why has Mephibosheth not come to join me? As all the people who are loyal to me, why has Mephibosheth not come with me?" Ziba said to him, "He's staying in Jerusalem because he thinks, 'Today the house of Israel will give me back my grandfather's kingdom.'" And the king said to Ziba, "All that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours." "I humbly bow," Ziba said. "May I find favor in the eyes, my lord the king." Does any of this smell fishy? How does it smell fishy? Yeah. Is Ziba telling the truth? We don't know. We don't know if Ziba's telling the truth. He says, the story he tells David is, here, I've brought you all these supplies. Where's Mephibosheth? Oh, he thinks he can now be the new king and restore the house of Saul. Oh, really? Well, guess what, Ziba? You can have all of Mephibosheth's property. So, is Ziba telling the truth, or is he doing this precisely to get the outcome that he gets, which is to get all of the property? We don't know. What possible reason would Mephibosheth have for not coming out to join David? He can barely walk. He can barely walk. His feet, both of his feet are all mangled. So the question is Ziba telling the truth about Mephibosheth's ambitions? Because now that Absalom has risen up and declared himself king, would it really make sense for Mephibosheth to become king? Would he have any followers? Would he have any, would this plan make any sense for Mephibosheth to somehow in the middle of all this to restore the house of Saul? Probably not. One of the things, again, in the Bible is when somebody says something, they're not always telling the truth. Just because a character in a biblical story says something, other than Jesus himself, just because somebody in the Bible says something doesn't always mean they're telling the truth. In this case, is he telling the truth? Well, maybe, maybe not. And we may find out, or we may not, as we keep reading. So, David keeps going. As King David approached Baharim, a man from the same clan as Saul's family came out from there. His name was Shimei, son of Gera, and he cursed as he came out. And curse does not mean profanity. Curse means, I curse you, may you have leprosy, may you fall and break your head open. Cursing like that, not cursing like using dirty words. Cursing like, may all these horrible things befall you. He pelted David and all the king's officials with stones, though all the troops and the special guard were on David's right and left. As he cursed, Shimei said, get out, you man of blood, you scoundrel. The Lord has repaid you for all the blood you shed in the household of Saul, in whose place you've reigned. The Lord has handed the kingdom over to your son Absalom. You've come to ruin because you're a man of blood. So he's following behind them, cursing David, putting curses upon David. So Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said to the king, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and cut off his head. Which you'd think, well, yeah, that's what's going to happen to somebody who curses a king like this. But the king said, what do you and I have in common, you sons of Zeruiah? If he's cursing because the Lord said to him, curse David, who can ask, why do you do it? In other words, maybe God told him to do this. I'm not going to kill him. David said to Abishai and all his officials, my son, who's of my own flesh, is trying to take my life. In other words, Absalom. How much more then this Benjamite? Leave him alone. Let him curse. The Lord's told him to. It may be that the Lord will see my distress and repay me with good for the cursing I'm receiving today. In other words, just let him yell, let him curse me. Just keep walking. David and his men continued along the road while Shimei was going along the hillside opposite him, cursing as he went, throwing stones at him, showering him with dirt, which is probably pretty irritating. Yeah, or stupid. The king and all the people with him arrived at their destination exhausted, and there he refreshed himself. Okay, so they've gotten a day's journey away from Jerusalem. So with this guy following all the way, throwing rocks, throwing dirt at him, cursing them all the way. Meanwhile, Absalom and all the men of Israel came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel was with him. Remember, Ahithophel, one of David's chief counselors and advisors. And Hushai, the Archite, David's friend, the undercover guy, went to Absalom and said to him, "Long live the king! Long live the king!" Absalom asked Hushai, "Is this the love you show your friend? Why didn't you go with your friend?" In other words, I know you are close to David. What are you doing here? You're one of David's buddies. Why aren't you with him? Why are you here? Hushai said to Absalom, "No, the one chosen by the Lord, by these people, and by all the men of Israel. His I will be. I'll remain with him. Furthermore, whom should I serve? Should I not serve the son? Just as I served your father, so I will serve you." Again, lies, lies, lies. But he's trying to convince Absalom that he is going to be loyal to him. Absalom said to Ahithophel, "Give us your advice. What should we do?" Ahithophel answered, "Lie with your father's concubines, whom he left to take care of the palace. Then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself a stench in your father's nostrils, and the hands of everyone with you will be strengthened." So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and he lay with his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. Again, not something that would happen probably in our modern society, but remember, this is a sign, it is a personal sign of disrespect to the king, to sleep with his harem, girls. And it says no reconciliation is possible. Once you've done that, there's no turning back. Once he's slept with his father's harem, there's no turning back. It's like the die is cast. This is, it's not like, well, we'll patch it up, we'll make up. No, doing this means there's no making up. There's no possible coming back together. And so Ahithophel says, do this as a way of saying you're all in. And you have totally disgraced your father. And if you remember, what did Nathan say to David right after the Bathsheba episode? Yeah. When talking about him sleeping with Bathsheba, he said, "What you did in private will be done to you in public." You slept with Bathsheba in private. A sexual assault will be done to you in the eyes of everyone. And this is what that is. Now, in those days, verse 16:23, in those days the advice of Ahithophel gave was like that of one who inquires of God. That was how David and Absalom regarded all of his advice. It doesn't say it was from God. It said it was so highly regarded, it was like that. So Ahithophel's advice is always great advice. And you're like, this advice was dead on. But now, there's more advice. What's the next step? Absalom says to Ahithophel, "What do I do next?" Ahithophel said to Absalom, "I would choose 12,000 men and set out tonight in pursuit of David. I would attack him while he's weary and weak. I would strike him with terror, and then all the people with him will flee. I would strike down only the king and bring all the people back to you. The death of the man you seek will mean the return of all. All the people will be unharmed. This plan seemed good to Absalom and to all the elders of Israel." This is a great plan from the perspective of Absalom. I mean, this is the right plan. Shock and awe. Don't let him catch his breath. Get him now. Don't let him get away. Go after him right now and kill just him, and then basically give amnesty to everybody else. His advice is good advice. But Absalom said, "Well, summon also Hushai the Archite so we can hear what he has to say. Let's get a second opinion." When Hushai came to him, Absalom said, "Well, Ahithophel has given us this advice. Should we do what he says? If not, give us your opinion." Here is Hushai's job. to give terrible advice and make it sound good. Hushai's job is to give bad advice, but dress it up so it sounds like good advice. So listen to how he gives his advice. Hushai replied to Absalom, "The advice Ahithophel has given you is not good this time. You know your father and his men, they're fighters, as fierce as a wild bear robbed of her cubs. Besides, your father is an experienced fighter. He won't spend the night with the troops. Even now, he's hidden in a cave or some other place. If he should attack your troops first, whoever hears about it will say, 'There's been a slaughter among the troops who follow Absalom.' Then even the bravest soldier, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will melt with fear. For all Israel knows that your father is a fighter, and that those with him are brave. So I advise you, let all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, as numerous as the sand on the seashore, be gathered to you, with you yourself leading them into battle. Then we'll attack him wherever he may be found. We'll fall on him as dew settles on the ground. Neither he nor any of his men will be left alive. If he withdraws to a city, then all Israel will bring ropes to that city and drag it down into the valley. Not even a piece of it will be found." Absalom and all the men of Israel said, "The advice of Hushai the Archite is better than that of Ahithophel." For the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. Why is Hushai's advice terrible advice from the standpoint of Absalom? Yeah, it gives David all this time. I mean, the first advice, Ahithophel's like, he's on the run. He's only a day's journey away from Jerusalem. He's tired. He's worn out. Go and kill him now. That was the good advice from the standpoint of Absalom. He's like, no, gather the troops from all the tribes, get people from all the tribes, and then when you get an enormous amount of men, then go hunt him down. And I mean, but he makes it sound like, well, your father, he's an experienced fighter, a great warrior. You're not going to catch him. I mean, and he feeds this bad advice, which Absalom takes, which is what saves David's life. So he gives this bad advice. Verse 15. Hushai told Zadok and Abiathar the priests, Ahithophel has advised Absalom and the elders of Israel to do such and such, but I've advised them to do so and so. Now, send a message immediately and tell David, don't spend the night at the fords in the desert. Cross over without fail, or the king and all the people with him will be swallowed up. In other words, don't stop. Go, go, go. And so the two sons of the two priests, Jonathan and Ahimaaz, were staying at En Rogel. A servant girl was to go and inform them, and they were to go and tell King David, for they couldn't risk being seen entering the city. But a young man saw them and told Absalom. So the two of them left quickly and went to the house of a man in Baharim. He had a well in his courtyard, and they climbed down into it. His wife took a covering and spread it over the opening of the well and scattered grain over it. No one knew anything about it. When Absalom's men came to the woman at the house and said, where are Ahimaaz and Jonathan? The woman said, oh, they crossed over the brook. And the men searched but found no one, and they returned to Jerusalem. So they hid in the well, put a covering over the well, put grain and stuff on top of the covering so it looked like there's nothing there. And they were successful. After the men had gone, the two climbed out of the well and went to inform King David. So they got the message to David. They said to him, set out and cross the river at once. Ahithophel has advised such and such against you, just in case they come now. David and all the people with him set out, crossed the Jordan, and by daybreak, no one who left had not crossed the Jordan. So they're now on the other side of the Jordan River. They're on the east of the Jordan River now. When Ahithophel saw that his advice had not been followed, he saddled his donkey and set out for his house in his hometown. He put his house in order and then hanged himself. So he died and was buried in his father's tomb. Huh? Yeah, he took being the other guy's advice, he took it pretty hard, yeah. the shame of having his advice rejected, coupled with the fact that he probably went, that's terrible advice. Absalom's going to lose. And if Absalom loses, I'm dead man anyway. So he saw the handwriting on the wall. He's like, if Absalom's listening to this guy, he's not gonna get David, and he's gonna lose, and all of us who were on his side are gonna be executed. And so I'm just gonna do it now by my own hand. I don't want to be tortured. So a combination of shame and self, and seeing the handwriting on the wall, he goes and kills himself, which removes him as a good advisor to Absalom. David went to Mahanaim, and Absalom crossed the Jordan with all the men of Israel. Absalom had appointed Amasa over the army in place of Joab. Again, Joab was David's commander. Joab has stayed with, Joab hasn't gone with David, but Absalom doesn't trust him. Amasa was the son of a man named Jether, an Israelite who had married Abigail, the daughter of Nahash and sister of Zeruiah, the mother of Joab. So it's all part of the same clan. The Israelites and Absalom camped in the land of Gilead. When David came to Mahanaim, Shobi, son of Nahash from Rabbah of the Ammonites, and Machir, son of Amiel from Lodabar, and Barzillai, the Gileadite from Rogalim, brought bedding and bowls and articles of pottery. They brought wheat and barley and flour and roasted grain and beans and lentils and honeys and curds and sheep and cheese and cow's milk for David and his people. And they said, the people have become hungry and tired and thirsty in the desert. So they get provisions. So now we got a civil war. We have a civil war, father and son, each with their followers. And they're going to go out and have battle with each other. They have a civil war. So David mustered the men who were with him and appointed over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. David sent the troops out, a third under the command of Joab, and Joab is with him, that's right. A third under Joab's brother Abishai, and a third under Ittai. So Joab has gone with David. The king told the troops, I myself will surely march out with you. David is going to lead the battle. But the men said, you must not go out. If we're forced to flee, they won't care about us. Even if half of us die, they won't care. You're worth 10,000 of us. It'd be better now for you to give us support from the city. They realize that the mission of Absalom is really to kill one person, which was the advice that Ahithophel gave him. He said, just kill David, and everything else will fall into place. The rest of them will fall in line. Don't kill anybody else and stir up bad blood. Just kill David. Whereas David's friend that gave the bad advice of go slaughter all of them. But David's men say, you need to stay behind because they don't care about us. They only are going to be after you. And David says, okay, verse 4, I'll do whatever seems best to you. So the king stood beside the gate while all the men marched out in units of hundreds and thousands, and the king commanded Joab, Abishai, his brother, and Ittai, this Philistine from Gath who had become one of David's inner circle of, core mighty men. Be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake. In other words, put down the rebellion, but take him alive. Don't kill my son. This is David the father speaking, not David the king, which David is saying, just be gentle with Absalom. All the troops heard the king giving orders concerning Absalom to each of the commanders. So the army marched into the field to fight Israel, and the battle took place in the forest of Ephraim. So here we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on the battle. The battle is going to be fought pretty much in this chapter. There the army of Israel was defeated by David's men. So David's men win this battle. And the casualties that day were great, 20,000 men. To this day, the Civil War killed more people than any other war America's ever fought. Civil wars are the worst wars there are. The battle spread over the whole countryside, and the forest claimed more lives that day than the sword. Now Absalom happened to meet David's men. He was riding his mule, and as the mule went under the thick branches of a large oak, Absalom's head got caught in the tree. He was left hanging in midair while the mule he was riding kept going. So a low branch or a low thicket of branch, he gets his head caught, the donkey keeps going, he's hanging there from a branch, by his hair and his head. Then one of the men saw this, and he told Joab, David's commander of David's forces, I just saw Absalom hanging in an oak tree. Joab said to the man who told him this, What, you saw him? Why didn't you strike him to the ground right there? I would have given you 10 shekels of silver and a warrior's belt. The man replied, Even if 1,000 shekels were weighed out into my hands, I would not lift my hand against the king's son. In our hearing, the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai protect the young man Absalom for my sake. If I'd put my life in jeopardy, and nothing's hidden from the king, you would have kept your distance from me. And Joab said, I'm not going to wait like this for you. He took 3 javelins in his hand and plunged them into Absalom's heart, while Absalom was still alive in the oak tree. And 10 of Joab's armor bearers surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. What do you think of Joab's decision there? He was definitely doing the right thing as a military man. You can't let Absalom live. David was thinking as a father, not as a king. Joab understood. You can't after what he's done, after Absalom has slept with the concubines, everything Absalom's done, there's no turning back. He has to die. Joab understood militarily David is not thinking straight as a king and as a general and as a warrior. David is thinking as a father, but he's wrong. And Joab says he's got to die, and he kills him. Which, as I say, you'd say it was ever right to kill somebody, but from a military standpoint, it's the right decision. So he kills him. Then Joab sounded the trumpet, and the troops started pursuing Israel. And when it says Israel, it means the people who were with Absalom. Joab halted them. They took Absalom, threw him into a big pit in the forest, piled up a large heap of rocks over him. Meanwhile, all the Israelites fled to their homes. So the battle is over really pretty quickly. During his lifetime, Absalom had taken a pillar and erected it in the king's valley as a monument to himself. For he thought, I have no son to carry on the memory of my name. He named the pillar after himself, and it's called Absalom's monument to this day. So Absalom has no children to be left as a potential other threat to the throne. Now here, I think, is the rest of this chapter and chapter 19 are some of the most heartbreaking chapters in the whole Bible. Now, Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, said, Let me run and take the news to the king that the Lord has delivered him from the hand of his enemies. You're not the one to take news today, Joab told him. You may take the news another time, but if you must not do it today, because the king's son is dead. Hey, your enemy is dead, King David. It's not how he's going to hear it. Joab said to a Cushite, somebody who's not an Israelite, you go tell the king what you've seen. And the Cushite bowed down before Joab and ran off. But Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, now this is one of the priest's sons, again said to Joab, Come what may, let me run behind the Cushite. Joab, but my son, why do you want to go? You don't have any news that will bring a reward. Remember how David has greeted messengers who have given him the good news that one of his enemies is David David has not received those kind of messengers well. You're not going to get a reward for this message. He said, come what may, I want to run. Joab said, run. And Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain and outran the Cushite. I want to tell him the news. While David is sitting between the inner and outer gates, the watchman up on the roof of the gateway by the wall, he looked out and he saw a man running alone. The watchman called out to the king and reported. The king said, well, if he's alone, he must have good news. The man came closer and closer. Then the watchman saw another man running, and he called down to the gatekeeper, another man's running alone. The king said, he must be bringing good news too. The watchman said, it seems to me that the first one runs like Ahimaaz, son of Zadok. Well, he's a good man, the king said. He comes with good news. So the son of the priest outruns the first guy. Ahimaaz called out to the king, all is well. He bowed down before the king with his face to the ground and said, praise be to the Lord your God. He has delivered up the men who lifted their hands against my lord the king. The king asked, is the young man Absalom safe? Ahimaaz answered, I saw great confusion. Just as Joab was about to send the king's servant and me, your servant, I don't know what it was. He realizes, I don't know what happened, really. It's kind of fuzzy, actually. I really don't know what happened. Now he realizes why he shouldn't have been so anxious to bring the message. And at the last minute, he realizes, I don't want to tell him this. The king said, stand here and wait. He stepped aside and stood there. Then the Cushite arrived and said, my lord the king, hear the good news. The Lord has delivered you today from all who rose up against you. The king asked the Cushite, is the young man Absalom safe? The Cushite replied, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up to harm you be like that young man. In other words, he's dead. May anybody who opposes you be dead, just like this young man is dead. And the king was shaken. He went up to the room over the gateway and wept. As he went, he said, oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son. I mean, this, again, I say this is a heartbreaking story because Absalom is not a good guy in any, you might say, okay, he's justified in killing his half-brother after his half-brother raped his sister. You might say, okay, that's righteous vengeance, even though vengeance is never celebrated in the Bible. But you'd say, okay, if somebody raped your sister, you would, out of just pure fury, you might kill somebody. Okay, but Absalom not only does that, he plots and schemes to overthrow his father. He lays, not only did he wait 2 years to take his revenge on his brother, he waits 4 years to start this uprising against David. He plotted and he schemed and he laid all the sugar and honey to if only I was up there judging, man, you'd see justice. And he did all this stuff to lay the groundwork. And then he went out to kill his father. And yet David is still his father, and David cannot celebrate his death. David cannot be glad that he's dead. That's where his role as king and his role as father are in opposition to each other. So, chapter 19, Joab, the commander of the army, was told, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom. And for the whole army, this is David's men, for the whole army that day was turned into mourning. Because on that day the troops heard it said, the king is grieving for his son. The men stole into the city that day as men steal in who are ashamed when they flee from battle. So, when men win a battle, what's supposed to happen? A big victory celebration. Remember when David and Saul defeated the Philistines? The women are dancing and singing and playing their tambourines, and Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands, and they're marching in. They're the victors. They've won the battle. These men who just won the battle are slinking back like they lost or like they were deserters. They slink into town. The king covered his face and cried aloud, "Oh, my son Absalom! Oh, Absalom, my son, my son!" Then Joab, the general, went into the house to the king and said, and here, man, I hope whenever they get to this in that drama, I hope they have this scene. "Today you have humiliated all of your men who have just saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters and the lives of your wives and concubines. You love those who hate you and you hate those who love you. You have made it clear today that the commanders and their men mean nothing to you. I see that you would be pleased if Absalom were alive today and all of us were dead. Now go out and encourage your men. I swear by the Lord that if you don't go out, not a man will be left with you by nightfall. This will be worse for you than all the calamities that have come upon you from your youth until now." Now that is a speech where he says, basically, what is wrong with you? You hate those who love you and you love those who hate you. And these men put their necks on the line for you. And you have not shown 1 ounce of appreciation. And if you don't, they're going to all desert you. If you don't do this before nightfall, you're going to lose every single one of them. And so the king got up and took his seat in the gateway. And when the men were told, the king sitting in the gateway, they all came before him. In other words, implying he went out to show his appreciation to the men. Now, again, what does this make you think about David? Right. He was a great warrior, a great general, a good king, and a lousy father. And that it was the flaw that that now is, if he had only disciplined his son who raped his sister, if he had only done something then, none of this would have happened. And Absalom probably would have succeeded him as king. But meanwhile, the Israelites had fled to their homes. And by the Israelites, again, we mean those who had followed Absalom. Throughout the tribes of Israel, people were all arguing with each other, saying, "The king delivered us from the land of our enemies. He's the one who rescued us from the hand of the Philistines. Now he's fled the country because of Absalom. And Absalom, whom we anointed to rule over us, has died in battle. So why do you say nothing about bringing the king back?" In other words, we messed up. We followed Absalom. He's dead now. And, it was David who, protected us from the Philistines and won all those battles. We should probably bring him back as king. And so King David sent his message to Zadok and Abiathar the priest. "Ask the elders of Israel, why should you be the last to bring the king back to his palace? Since what's being said throughout Israel has reached the king at his quarters. You're my brothers, my own flesh and blood. Why should you be the last to bring back the king? And say to Amasa, are you not my own flesh and blood? May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if from now on you are not the commander of my army in place of Joab." He's going to replace Joab. Why? Because Joab killed Absalom. Again, he's thinking there not with his brain, with his heart. He won the hearts of all the men of Judah as though they were one man. They sent word to the king, "Return, you and your men." The king returned and went as far as the Jordan. And the men of Judah came to Gilgal to go out and meet the king and bring him across the Jordan. And all these guys hurried to meet him. And there were 1,000 Benjamites, Saul's tribe, along with Ziba, the steward of Saul's household, and his 15 sons and 20 servants. And they rushed to the Jordan where the king was, and they crossed at the ford to take the king's household over and do whatever he wished. Then Shimei, the guy who was throwing rocks and mud and carrots, Shimei, son of Gera, crossed the Jordan, fell prostrate before the king and said to him, "May my lord not hold me guilty. Don't remember how your servant did wrong on the day my lord king left Israel. May the king put it out of his mind. I, your servant, know that I've sinned. Today I've come here as the first of the whole household of Joseph to come down and meet my lord the king." And Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said, "Shouldn't Shimei be put to death for this? He cursed the Lord's anointed. Now, let's kill this dog." David replied, "What do you have in common, sons of Zeruiah? This day you've come before become my adversary. Should anyone be put to death in Israel today? Do I not know that today I'm king over Israel?" The king said to Shimei, "You won't die." And the king promised him, nobody's going to die today. This is not only pure compassion and mercy, it's also political. Why kill a member of this tribe? Why? What does it really do for me other than vengeance? What does it do for me to kill him? If I show beneficence, if I show mercy, that's all going to be in my favor. Mephibosheth, Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth, Saul's grandson, also went down to meet the king. He had not taken care of his feet, or trimmed his mustache, or washed his clothes from the day the king left until the day he returned safely. When he came from Jerusalem to meet the king asked him, "Why didn't you go with me, Mephibosheth?" That's what he wanted to know. Why didn't you come with me? After you sat at my table and all that, why didn't you come with me? He said, "My lord the king, since I, your servant, am lame, I said I will have my donkey saddled and I'll ride on it so I can go with the king. But Ziba, my servant, betrayed me, and he slandered your servant to my lord the king. My lord the king is like an angel of God. Do whatever pleases you. All my grandfather's descendants deserve nothing but death from my lord the king. You gave your servant a place among those who eat at your table. So what right do I have to make any more appeals to the king?" So he says, "I was going to come. I didn't have a ride. Ziba betrayed me. I couldn't get there. Ziba lied about me and slandered me." So who's telling the truth? Ziba or Mephibosheth? We don't know, do we? We don't know who was telling the truth. One of them's lying. We don't know which one's lying. So what's David going to do about it? 29, the king said to him, "Why say more? Order you and Ziba to divide the land." I don't know who's telling the truth here. You each get half. I don't have time to figure this out. Divide it between you. And Mephibosheth said to the king, "Let him take everything, now that my lord the king has arrived home safely." Which, of course, makes me think Mephibosheth is probably the one telling the truth. Kind of like Solomon and the two prostitutes, yeah. The one who said, "Let her have the baby," and she's the real mother, yeah. Barzillai the Gilead also came down from Rogalim to cross the Jordan with the king and to send him on his way. Now Barzillai was a very old man, 80 years old. He'd provided for the king during his stay in Mahanaim. He was a very wealthy man. The king said to him, "Cross over with me. Stay with me in Jerusalem. I'll provide for you." And just because we're running kind of low, he basically says, I'm old. I got plenty. I'm going to be a burden. Just let me go home. That's pretty much all of that. And so the king, verse 40, the king crossed over to Gilgal, Kimham crossed with him, all the troops of Judah, half the troops of Israel had taken the king over. Soon all the men of Israel were coming to the king and saying to him, "Why did our brothers, the men of Judah, steal the king away and bring him and his household across the Jordan together with all his men?" And the men of Judah answered the men of Israel, "We did this because the king's closely related to us. Why are you angry about it? Have we eaten any of the king's provisions? Have we taken anything for ourselves?" And the men of Israel said to the men of Judah, "We have 10 shares in the king. Besides, we have a greater claim on David than you have. Why have you treated us with contempt? Were we not the first to speak of bringing him back?" But the men of Judah responded even more harshly than the men of Israel. So there's still some animosity between the tribe of Judah, which is the biggest tribe, David's tribe, and the 10 northern tribes saying, "Well, how come you got to accompany him back? What about us? We got 10 shares, you got 1 share." And there's still tension between the 10 northern tribes and the tribe of Judah. And we're going to see that, and we're not going to see it in this because we're going to run out of time, but spoiler alert, again, when David dies, who becomes king? Solomon. Solomon expands the territory of Israel, builds the temple, has people coming from all over the world to seek his wisdom, on and on. I mean, David and Solomon are the 2 great kings. Solomon, oldest son, is named Rehoboam. When Solomon dies, his son Rehoboam becomes the new king of the united 12 tribes. When I say 10 northern tribes in Judah, remember the Levites are a tribe that didn't have land. They served in the temple. So we got the 12 tribes. Rehoboam, son of Solomon, becomes king. And he asked his father's advisors, "What should be the first thing I do?" And they said, "Well, to build that temple and all that, there was a lot of slave labor. There was a lot of taxation. Solomon, took a lot out of us to build all this stuff. So our advice to you, Rehoboam, is to speak gently. Say, I'm going to be a shepherd to you. I'm going to ease your burdens. I'm going to, treat you kindly." Rehoboam goes to his young friends. "What do you think I should say?" They say, "Here's what you need to say. You need to say, 'If you thought my father was hard on you, wait till you get a load of me. If he whipped you with whips, I'm going to whip you with scorpions. My genitals are bigger than my father,' etc., etc., etc." And what do you think the 10 northern tribes say? They say, "We're out of here." And that is when the 10 northern tribes split from Judah and Benjamin. That's when we have the division of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Because Rehoboam listened to his young friends and gave this speech about, "If you thought my dad was tough, wait till you get I'm 10 times tougher than he is. I'm going to be harder on you than he ever was." And the 10 northern tribes go, "We're out of here." And they picked a different king, Jeroboam, to be their new king. And the 2 tribes, the 2 kingdoms, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah or Judea, remain divided forever until the northern 10 are conquered by the Assyrians, and eventually the southern tribe conquered by the Babylonians. But that split between the 2 halves of the kingdom is brought about by David's grandson, who creates this division. So again, it's like, the lesson there is all kinds of things. One of it is like, do you listen to the old seasoned pros, or do you listen to your young guys that you used to go out and drinking with? Probably probably listened to the guys with some seasoning and a little bit of experience. And Rehoboam took the other route. But anyway, we're still back with David. And, some of this, just to wrap this up, there's still a trouble. It says in verse 20, or chapter 20, now a troublemaker named Sheba, son of Bichri, a Benjamite, happened to be there. This is when they bring David back as the king of the United Tribes. We have no share in David, no part in Jesse's son. Every man to his tent, O Israel. And so, basically this chapter, he has a brief rebellion that goes nowhere. The point of that chapter is this never goes anywhere. This new little rebellion doesn't go anywhere. But look at chapter 20, verse 3, because David gets back and say this mini rebellion doesn't amount to anything, so I'm not even going to go over those. When David returned to his place in Jerusalem, he took the 10 concubines he had left to take care of the palace and put them in a house under guard. He provided for them, but did not lie with them. They were kept in confinement till the day of their death, living as widows. So, once they had been with his son, he could never go into them again as his harem. He couldn't give them, they were damaged goods, sadly. So they lived in confinement until the day of their death. They were collateral damage of all of this. Now, remember, what about David replacing Joab? Let's go down to verse 4 of 20, verse 4. The king said to Amasa, his new commander, "Summon the men of Judah to come with me within 3 days. Be here yourself." But when Amasa went to summon Judah, he took longer than the time the king had set for him. So David said to Abishai, "Now Sheba son of Bichri will do," this is still fighting this little minor rebellion, "will do us more harm than Absalom did. Tell your master's men to pursue him. You'll find fortified cities and escape from us." Joab's men and the Kerethites and the Pelethites and all the mighty warriors went out from under the command. And they marched out from Jerusalem to pursue Sheba. And while they were at the great rock in Gibeon, here's the more interesting part. Amasa came to meet them. And Joab was wearing his military tunic. The former commander meets the new commander. And strapped over it at his waist was a belt with a dagger in its sheath. This is foreshadowing here. As he stepped forward, it dropped out of its sheath. Joab said to Amasa, "How are you, my brother?" And Joab took Amasa by the beard with his right hand to kiss him. Amasa was not on his guard against the dagger in Joab's hand, and Joab plunged it into his belly, and his intestines spilled out on the ground. Without being stabbed again, Amasa died. And then Joab and his brother Abishai pursued Sheba, son of Bichri. So Joab apparently was left-handed. He grabs him by the beard with his right hand, reaches down. So, verse 11, one of Joab's men stood beside Amasa and said, "Whoever favors Joab and whoever is for David, let him follow Joab." And Amasa lay wallowing in his blood in the middle of the road. The men saw that all the troops came to a halt there. They realized everyone who came up to Amasa stopped, dragged him from the road, threw him in a field with a garment over him. After Amasa had been removed from the road, all the men went on with Joab to pursue this fellow Sheba. And anyway, they end up squelching that. This is a little bit of what we need to know about Joab, that Joab plays a very big role. And David's relationship with Joab, of course, is he relies on him heavily, but Joab has his own agenda. He always has his own agenda. Remember, he killed the other general, and now he's killed the new general, and he is highly political. And before we finish, the rest of this, frankly, is a lot of it's poetry and David reiterating things about how he spared Mephibosheth, things like that. I'm not going to go into all that, but the last words of David, and there's a they take count, and there's lots of lists of names, but if you want to read on your own before the miniseries gets there, the next in line really of after Amnon and Absalom, the next in line to be king was Adonijah in terms of David's son in birth order. When David dies, he sets himself up to be king, but there is palace intrigue, and there's a party that favors him, there's a party that favors Solomon. And as you read in the first few chapters of 1 Kings, Solomon wins that battle. Solomon ends up with the crown, even though he is not the next oldest son. Solomon does end up as the new king, mainly because he has a lot of the court on his side. Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, his mother, of course, Bathsheba, others are all working to put him in place to succeed his father. And one of the things that you'll read about when, David had basically promised not to kill Joab, but before he dies, he says to Solomon, take care of Joab. In other words, I promised not to kill him. That doesn't mean you can't kill him. And he's going to finally get rid of him before he dies, or after he dies. He wants to make sure that Joab dies too. And the intrigue between the court intrigue that starts in 1 Kings, centers around who will succeed David. Again, we know it's Solomon. God says to Solomon, because of your father, I'm going to give you something. What do you want? And Solomon doesn't ask for riches, and he doesn't ask for power. What does he ask for? Wisdom. And, we mentioned the famous story of, the two widows, the two prostitutes who bring a child to Solomon. They each claim that it's their child, and that there's a dead baby that got rolled on top of, and there's a living child, and they both say the dead baby is hers and the living baby is mine, and they go back and forth. And David and Solomon says, well, just cut the baby in half, each get half, right? Which you think, that's terrible judgment. At which point the real mother says, she can have him, I don't kill him, she can have him. And then Solomon says, well, you're obviously the real mother. And, that shows an example of his wisdom and his judgment. The sad thing about Solomon is we find out that he has hundreds of wives and concubines. Hundreds. And most of them foreign princesses and arranged marriages from all these other kingdoms that he wants to have peace with. And they do, of course, bring in their idols, bring in their gods, bring in their religion, and start to turn Solomon's heart away from God. He's wise, but not wise in that way. His weakness, somewhat like his father, is women. And he ends up, at the end of his life, allowing idolatry to come into the country. Then I said what his son, Rehoboam, does is split the country. And 1 and 2 Kings, which some of the stories are really interesting and some of them, frankly, are not as interesting. But the cycle that you see that follows all this is the people falling into sin, and because of their sin, they have enemies all around them, and they finally call out, oh, God, rescue us, and they turn back to the Lord, and God delivers them from their enemies, and they're righteous, and they follow God for a little bit, and then they fall into sin again. And it goes around and around and around, and it's like bad king, bad king, bad king, good king, bad king, bad king, bad king, good king. There'll be like 3 or 4 bad kings in a row in both kingdoms, in the northern kingdom of Israel and in the southern kingdom of Judah or Judea. They each will have like really bad kings, and then finally they'll have a good king. They'll try to bring everybody back to the Lord. but invariably that good king will die and his son will be bad, and they can't get a string of good kings until that northern kingdom, the 10 northern tribes, are invaded by the Assyrians. That happens in around 725 BC. That the northern kingdom is conquered by Assyria, which modern Syria. The southern kingdom escapes the Assyrians, but in 586 BC, the southern kingdom is invaded by Babylon, the Babylonians. They tear down the temple. They tear down the walls of Jerusalem. They take the best and brightest of the young men into captivity in Babylon. And, that's where we have books like Daniel and all that during the time of the captivity. After 2 generations, the Babylonians are conquered by the Persians. In modern terms, Iraq is conquered by Iran. The Persians conquer the Babylonians and allow the Jews who are in captivity in Babylon to return back to Jerusalem. They rebuild the walls. They build what's called the Second Temple. But it's much less magnificent than Solomon's temple. And that's the Old Testament tells that story of the return of the exiles to Jerusalem and Judea. And after that, they continue to be conquered. After they're conquered by the Persians and allowed to leave, then they're conquered by the Greeks, Alexander the Great, all that bunch. Then, of course, they're eventually conquered by the Roman Empire. And that's where we find the New Testament. They're under the thumb of Rome. Herod, the same Herod who killed the babies of Bethlehem trying to wipe out Jesus, that Herod the Great, rebuilt the Second Temple to bring it closer to what Solomon had built. They even call it Herod's Temple because of all the renovation that Herod does to the temple. That's one of the good things he does, in addition to being a horrible, malicious tyrant and murderer. He does upgrade the temple. And that temple, that Second Temple, is upgraded, and that's the temple that's there in the time of Jesus. Jesus dies somewhere approximately 33 AD. And just about 35 years later, the Romans come and destroy the Second Temple and knock it to the ground. And all that's left of that Second Temple is one wall, one western wall, which is called the Wailing Wall. And you can go, I've been to it, and if you go to Jerusalem, you can go to that one wall, which was the western wall of the temple. And that's where, Jews come to pray. And what sits on the place where the main part of the temple stood, is a mosque. The Dome of the Rock mosque sits where that temple, Solomon's temple, stood. So that's a few thousand years of history in a couple of minutes. But this is what this is the saga of the Old Testament, but the Old Testament tells of all the kings. And all of the descendants of David and Solomon continue in the southern kingdom until the Babylonians drag the last one off into captivity. But the line of David continues, except by the first century, to be a descendant of David didn't really get you anywhere. Joseph is a descendant of David, but that didn't give him any privileges or money or anything else. But Joseph is of the house of David. And that means Jesus is born into the house of David. So, all that to say, when Jesus comes into Jerusalem, remember, what do they say? Hosanna, Son of David. Hosanna, Son of David. Save us, Son of David. Because by son of, they mean descendant of. Save us, descendant of, because the prophet said someday a descendant of David will have an eternal throne. And that, of course, is Jesus. So David figures prominently in the story of Jesus as to why one of the titles that Jesus is given. One of the ways that the people expect him to be like David. But of course, Jesus is not like David in terms of being a military man. His mission is quite different, which is why this Sunday we'll talk about him riding into town on a donkey, not on a horse, as a sign of peace. So anyway, I'm a little over. So anyway, if you want to keep reading or keep, let's say that miniseries on Amazon Prime only goes up to Goliath. So anyway. First and Second Chronicles is actually just basically a retelling of First and Second Kings. It'll be the same stories told slightly differently and sometimes word for word. Just like, there was more than one book written about the kings. And so both, if you read First and Second Kings and then you'll read First and Second Chronicles and like, I already read this. Or it's pretty much very much similar stuff. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, and sometimes you'll see even in Kings, it'll say like, as for the rest of his reign, are they not recorded in this book? That kind of stuff. And First and Second Chronicles basically are covering a lot of the same territory as First and Second Kings. Yeah. Sadly, they both end with being carried off into exile by the Babylonians. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. Well, usually, when I was talking about Lazarus and all that a couple weeks ago in the sermon, back then weeping was not. It was. It was wailing would be probably a better word for that culture. The people as they're leaving are lamenting and wailing and weeping in a very loud and demonstrative way. Weeping or when they wept, it doesn't mean they were just dabbing their eyes with a tissue. I mean, they are moaning and shrieking and crying out loud and wringing their hands. And I mean, and I remember, for the first time, reading about that and how we kind of think, oh, and you say, well, is that way of mourning more or less healthy than how we mourn? The sort of the British model, the stiff upper lip and all that, is keeping the stiff upper lip when you're upset better than letting out all that yelling and crying and screaming? Which one is healthier? Which is, I don't know. But in that part of the country, in that part of the world today, it's still, mourning is much, much louder and more demonstrative than probably we think of mourning. If you ever watched, even today when they show people in the Middle East, they show the funerals of them carrying a coffin through the streets after, people are shrieking and crying, and it's very, very, it's not quiet at all. So when it says Jesus wept, the shortest verse in the Bible, he probably, if he's part of the culture, he's probably a groan, a moan and a groan, and not just a dab your eye thing, So anyway, well, we got Palm Sunday coming. Pray that all of our water issues are solved. I think they should be. They're coming out tomorrow. If you didn't hear, we got a pipe burst under the ground, and so anyway, we had water bubbling up out of the ground this morning. So no, we didn't strike oil, unfortunately. No, it's a pipe. Yeah, up from the ground. What? Well, Texas tea, right? Yeah. 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 Oh, yeah. I think I could sing the whole song, probably. Come and listen to a story. About a man named Jed. Yeah. Let's pray. Lord, we are grateful for all that you do and these stories that give us background and insight into our lives and the life of Jesus. Lord, we thank you that we have these stories that show people as very human, not always making good choices, but they're human, and your love is there. And David, for all his flaws and faults, we know he loved you and sought to follow you, and we love you and we want to follow you too. Go with us now, Lord. Amen. Yeah, I mean, these, the